Great. Thanks so much. Thanks for having us. So, as I said, that we are about a year old. In case for those watching, we are called Audiomatic. Uh, we are at audiomatic.in. We currently have 5 podcasts. Vikram Doctor here hosts one of our most popular ones. It's called the Real Food Podcast. We have a science podcast, which is uh, just to be telegraphic, it's kind of the Indian Radio Lab. It's called the Intersection. We have a podcast that 2 stand-up comics do. It's called Our Last Week, but it's a fortnightly, so that's kind of the comedy inbuilt. We have a podcast around Indian mythology and Indian philosophy called the Myth and Culture Podcast. And we have a current affairs podcast that's done by one of the sort of better known kind of television talking heads and commentators, newspaper columnist called Ask Akar Anything. And so we, as I said, we are about a year old. And to that extent, the podcast business in India is about a year old. We were the first podcast network in India. There's one other network and probably a couple of other individual podcasts now.
Actually, a lot. I mean, suddenly everybody seems to be talking about doing a podcast.
Yeah, okay.
Politics is not a matter, but everybody wants to.
Yeah, so I think it depends on so you have the sort of slightly more organized, podcasts that are researched and produced and scripted, and then you have the sort of more sort of mom and pop type. I mean, obviously, all of them are welcome because we are trying to grow the market.
No, all of them are not welcome. Some of them are really bad.
I'm more diplomatic than Vikram Doctor, obviously. But I think that just to go back a little bit, I think to understand why, even though we are such a large market, 1.2 billion people, probably a couple of 100 million people who consume media, all kinds of media.
And traditionally a large radio market. I mean, like All India Radio, which is our national broadcaster, is really huge. But
what's been missing is that private radio came very late to India. So, I remember I've worked in private radio, in FM radio for 20 years. And I remember in 2003 when, the first .com bust had already happened, we would go around saying that radio was a new medium in India, which was ridiculous. But FM privatization, so you had just for you to understand, you had non-government owned radio for the first time to a very small extent, which is that we had a couple of hours on the government owned frequencies in the late 90s, and then we had 24-hour radio stations where you had your own frequency on the dial only in towards 2002, 2003. So that's how new the radio business market is.
And even those FM channels have to operate with a lot of restrictions.
Yeah,
right?
so even now you can't do news on FM radio. And we have zero talk radio in India. Now, what that does is that unlike public radio in the US, NPR or BBC in the UK, where you have this culture of listening to talk radio, you have a culture of listening to non-music radio. We only have top 40 for the last 20 years, 30 years. We've only had top 40 Bollywood music on the radio
and cricket, which was big.
But since television, almost no one listens to the cricket on the radio. But so essentially, when we first started, sort of researching what we could do with podcasts and what people would listen to and how they would listen, I think one of the biggest challenges that we faced and we sort of continue to face is that the idea of listening to something for a length of time that doesn't involve music, which you can sort of, listen to in a more distracted sort of way, was very, very new. So while people would love the concept and they'd love the subjects and they'd love the topics, and if you sort of, if you tied them down and made them listen to it, they would absolutely love the content that we were putting out. It's not a habit, and therefore what we've had to deal with is sort of, there is no, just to answer a question that Jason Bryant asked, there is no, we don't have, I mean, the only thing that we have on the AM radio is government broadcasting. So there is no talk radio whatsoever. And almost anyone who is under the age of 50, I would say, in India, would have not grown up listening to the radio. Radio will not be part of their habit.
And I was trying to check, what this does, and this is something I've realized interacting with podcasters like the ones I met and listened to over the last year, is that radio is very top down in India. It's just unidirectional from the government to the listener. There's no community building. And one thing I've appreciated, listening to podcasters is the importance of community radio. I mean, I think especially in the US, so many people, get into radio because it's community radio. Either it's your local radio station, which you switch on and, listen to the weather news, or in college radio. I mean, I've understood how many podcasters really cut their teeth on college radio, which you don't have over here in India.
Yeah, and I think the background for that is that because radio had very, very high reach, 90% or 98%, if I remember correctly, of the population can be covered by radio. And because of that, it's always been seen as a propaganda medium. Even now, our Prime Minister has a fortnightly show which is called Man Ki Baat, which roughly translated means straight from the heart, or rather his heart, where essentially, he talks about things that the government is doing, and the private FM stations are mandated to carry that broadcast. So
to get an American equivalent, you have to go back to Roosevelt's fireside chats. That's how antiquated it is, but it's really important and big for the government over here.
So the idea of a podcast where there is no Bollywood film music, in a sense that you're not making it easier for people to listen. It's not like carrot and stick, where you say that if you listen to 3 minutes of chat, I'll throw in a song because you've been a good boy. It's 15-20 minutes of storytelling. The idea itself is alien. And I think one of the reasons why sort of we're harping about that is because it's not as if even educated people who would, otherwise subscribe to Netflix or watch videos on YouTube or read the New York Times, they're not necessarily aware of what a podcast is. They've never listened to a podcast before, and therefore it's like concept selling the idea of podcast one listener at a time.
I mean, it's crazy the sort of conversation we've had in the last year. I mean, you tell people, I'm doing a podcast. They're like, what's a podcast? And then you say, well, it's internet radio. So then they'll say, oh, it's internet radio. What channel do we listen on, and what time do we have to log into? You have to say, no, it's internet radio. It's always on. You just download. So then they'll say, oh, do we have to buy an internet radio to listen to it? And you have to say, no, your smartphone is an internet radio. I mean, you break our heads on this all the time.
And in fact, if in the chat window, I've just posted a link which you can watch after this. It's a YouTube video that we put up, which essentially tells people how to listen to a podcast.
Using his kids. We got his kids to do it.
Yeah, and you will see that it's deliberately very, very simplistic. And the reason we used a child voice is it's almost to say that if a child can do this, so can you. And so that's sort of one part of the story. Okay, but so you might be tempted to ask, then why the hell do you continue to do this?
It's not for the money, believe me.
So I think that the other side of the story is that India is a huge market. I mean, almost any. In fact, Vikram Doctor talked about this on one of his recent podcasts. That if you take even any small niche of the Indian market, it's probably 10 million people, which is a large market, captive market anywhere else in the world. And in terms of other media, we are very evolved. So we have a very, very evolved digital ecosystem we have many YouTube MCNs, we have Netflix here, we have a couple of Indian equal, one of them owned by News Corp, which is Hotstar, which is like the Indian Netflix. And then we have a whole bunch of other print and television and online players and other media. So other media is very, very evolved. And therefore, we assume that radio will catch on to the extent, and podcasts, which sort of, which helps us sort of leapfrog over the otherwise the spectrum restrictions and the licensing restrictions. We believe that with such high penetration of smartphones, essentially what we are trying to do is get people who've perhaps never listened to radio, or definitely don't listen to the radio as a habit.
Lost the radio habit. They may have had it, but they just lost it.
Yeah. Or maybe have it playing in the background because there's some music and it's some noise when you're in the car. Get those people, bring them in sort of, one story, one podcast at a time. And that's one of the reasons also why we decided to steer clear of, Bollywood and cricket and the usual, because our assumption is that there's enough of that with all the other on all the other media platforms. And here, what we are really looking at is getting people to come and listen to, let's say, a science podcast, or what Vikram does, which is a food history podcast, which is content that they just cannot find anywhere else on the Indian media spectrum. What I'll do now is I'll get Vikram Doctor to talk a little bit more about his show and how he sort of goes about it and what his learnings have been, and then come back.
Yeah, just to take up a bit from what Rajesh was saying, I mean, I think potential is really large in India because historically we've always been an oral culture. I mean, not oral. Because, all our we have this long traditions of storytelling, of, the myths and all our histories, which were originally oral and translated. One, the way older to my podcast, I mean, we always took it as a granted that young people would get into it. And with older people, there is the hesitation of listening over the internet. But when they listen, they really get into it. And I'm understanding through that how powerful you can be and how we have to forget about it in India to some extent, right? I mean, that's also been your experience. Yeah, the odd people who really respond to podcasts that we weren't expecting.
Yeah, so the medium gives us to a certain set of audiences which otherwise any other, which probably a medium like a YouTube channel or a newspaper wouldn't give you. So that's been a unique point of this medium, as well as the show and the topic that we cover.
Yeah, I mean, it's a small anecdote, but I mean, very soon after I started doing the podcast, I have an uncle who had a stroke, which is, he's fairly motor impaired. But the one thing he really listens to is the podcast. It's one thing he can listen to. And, he listens to it so much that we actually finally recorded a series of the podcast so we could play it again. And I thought that was really quite moving, that the way podcasts can connect with people who haven't really, didn't realize it.
And whatever feedback we have been getting from listeners, that they listen to it a lot during their commute time, since the urban space and the urban planning in India is pretty bad. Everybody takes almost an hour and a half or almost 2 hours to reach from workplace to back home. So that's the time they can listen to stuff that what we are producing on other podcasts.
Or they listen to it on the gym on the treadmill. And I get a lot of things saying, people from saying, why it's really difficult if we're talking about food and I'm trying to lose weight at the same time. But for me, it's really been interesting because I'm a print journalist. I write features for a national newspaper, and I had no radio experience at all when I got into this. And I was pretty reluctant, to be honest. I mean, Rajesh is really old friend. He had to twist my arm a lot, to do this podcast. And I was coming to completely new. But what it has struck me is that it actually takes me back to the basics of what I do with feature writing. I mean, what's really important is the story. I mean, you have to have a strong story for any episode that I'm doing. and it takes me back, obsessively to what is the story and how do you get interesting voices to help you tell that story. And to me, that has been the really interesting personal experience of scripting the podcasts. There have been some other interesting things that have come up. I mean, one slightly oddball issue, and I'd be curious to hear how other podcasters deal with it, has been the question of how to handle languages and accents, because this came up when we started, recording interviews, because especially for the food podcast, because we speak to a lot of ladies, older ladies, who are really good cooks, but who don't necessarily speak good English or English at all. So, this happened very early. I think that, how do we handle multiple languages in India, in a podcast? Because, of course, in India, you have so many languages. And I think Abdul hit upon a really cool solution.
So basically, what BBC Radio has been doing is to dub the voice over it, but to kind of keep the original voice in the first 10 seconds and in the last 10 seconds, so that the listener gets the feel of the delivery of the voice and how it's being said. And in the center, you can keep the translation bit, so that both you are transferring the information of whatever the person is saying. At the same time, the listener gets the feel and the emotion with which a person is speaking.
Yeah, so that's one. The other technical issue which has been interesting for me has been the question of accents, because obviously many people come with many different accents, and especially for this podcast, we interview a lot of people from around the world. We've interviewed a lot of British historians about food in India, and it's been really interesting seeing how people deal with the accents when they listen to the podcast. I mean, when I grew up, there was still the legacy of the BBC and that sort of received English, slightly posh accent for speaking English. But I realized that has gone to a large extent. I mean, the default is now a sort of neutral American accents, from Hollywood. And as a result of which, I think people really struggle to understand a lot of British accents. I think we've had this problem, right? I mean, some of the British people we've spoken to are very hard to understand.
Yeah. But that's also we do it over phone, so that also complicates.
Sorry, I'm just reading Jason Bryan's question. Good question. I mean,
So I'll try and answer, Jason. I'll try and answer that question. I think that one of the things that we, because of all the things I talked about earlier, one of the things that we work very hard with is to try and work with distribution partners such as online news sites to get the podcast out. So I think that with Vikram Doctor's podcast, I think his publication, he works for the Economic Times. He was being very humble. Vikram is one of the India's sort of best known food writers, definitely the most respected. He writes a weekly column for the equivalent of the Wall Street Journal in India, which is the Economic Times, which is part of the Times of India, which is arguably India's largest media company. I think they have been supportive of it. I think the only restriction that we have is we cannot distribute Vikram Doctor's podcast on any other media platform that might be seen as a competitor to Times of India. And to that extent, I personally think that Vikram would have 10x the number of listeners he does now if we had wider distribution. But that's something that. But there are, so Huffington Post India is part of the Times of India. They are a partner, and we distribute this podcast through Huffington Post. I think to answer your question about cricket, perhaps there should be a cricket podcast. Maybe it would be.
We've talked about this. I'm trying to find someone to do it.
Yeah, but I think exactly. I think I think that you have to spend a day in any Indian market, in any Indian city, to know the sort of absolute overload there is in terms of cricket content on the radio, in print, on television, online, on the mobile, through WhatsApp. I mean, everywhere. So if you were to do a cricket podcast, it would have to bring something that it would have to steer clear of rights, because the cricket organizations are horrible when it comes to using even 1 second of any match footage or any recordings that they have. So you would have to be able to do something that didn't involve actually having cricketers on the podcast, because they're impossible to get. They probably cost like $1 million for 1 hour of their time, and I'm not exaggerating. It is that much. So you wouldn't be able to get there. You wouldn't be able to get any archival footage. So essentially, you would have to have opinion that was of such a high quality that you could carry a podcast without having any, pretty much not having any other support material. Perhaps we will get down to it. We haven't yet.
Yeah, I mean, I think not that obviously it would be great to do a cricket podcast and a Bollywood podcast, but there's so much background noise about both cricket and Bollywood going on all the time. And also, as Rajesh says, this question of access. I mean, accessing anyone in Bollywood or accessing anyone in cricket means like dealing with PR people and dealing with, say, half the time you have to explain to the PR people what a podcast is. Yeah. Then you have to explain to whatever intermediaries what a podcast is. And then you have to take you seriously. Yeah. And I only have to deal with housewives. I mean, it's easy for me.
Yeah. Also, just to give you a sense of it, imagine the volume of the US election coverage right now. It's like that here all the time with cricket and Bollywood. So like cricket and Bollywood are our Trump and Clinton, and therefore.
And the question of rights is an important one. I mean, we would love to use, say, more Bollywood songs and things like that, but we just can't. I mean, we will never be able to afford the sort of fees for the royalty fees for using any of that. I mean,
I'll talk you through some of the other. So the other podcast that we do that has been very popular, surprisingly, because it's called The Intersection. It is a science podcast, but it tells science stories from India. So we've covered topics like a rare blood group that's called the Bombay blood group that. Is not. I mean, it's not that only people from Bombay have that blood group, but it was discovered here. We've talked about disappearing languages in India. We've talked about, we did a special after the Nepal earthquake, explaining the science behind earthquakes. And you can look at all of this.
The Pluto mission.
Yeah.
And, I think I can, because our formats are similar, The Intersection and my podcast. I think one huge and perhaps underappreciated advantage that podcasts have is that setting it up is so easy. It's just a telephone call. If I was to do this for a television or even a YouTube video, it would involve so much more preparation. I'd have to get a camera. I'd have to get probably a makeup artist. I'd have to set someone's time. And, as soon as you get to that, people are just like, oh my God, this is a whole different level. Whereas so often here, both for The Intersection and for my podcast, it's just a question of getting someone to take a phone call.
Yep.
And that, I think, is a huge advantage with podcasts, often overlooked.
Yeah, so for example, for the Bombay Blood Group podcast, we spoke to a doctor who had worked on that in the 50s, who is now almost 90 years old. We've spoken to scientists from NASA. We've spoken to people working in labs all over the world. Similarly, with Vikram Doctor's podcast, we've had chefs from a chef from a small town in India who speaks no English, who probably would have never been ever covered by any kind of mainstream media, but we've told his story. And I think one of the advantages that therefore we have is that because what we are doing is so different, and I'd like to think we're doing it quite well, is that a lot of the sort of opinion makers catch on to this thing very quickly and are appreciative of it. So we have a lot of journalists, well-known journalists, well-known writers, well-known television presenters who constantly post new episodes of our podcast on their social media. I think we've had press coverage in here that has been, and some internationally, that has been completely disproportionate to the size of our business. We've been covered by every significant weekend newspaper. We've had large spreads. on with reviews of our podcast, talking about how we went about setting up Audiomatic, and therefore there is an FM radio network that's in 6-7 big cities in India that carries clips of our podcasts every week. So
and Rajesh gets so many people coming to him saying, "I want to do a podcast."
Yeah. So I think that to that extent, therefore, the learning, especially for both Vikram and I, who worked in media for many years, the learning has been that just because something is small, is perhaps not a reason to not do it. Because if you do it well, and you sort of stay at it, you do see traction. We started with a couple of hundred listeners in our first few episodes. Now, it's still, the numbers are still really small. They are in the tens of thousands rather than the hundreds of thousands that we would like it to be. But as I said, that often with these things, you sort of stay at it, and then one day, you hit what people call the inflection point, and boom, suddenly the market sort of woken up to it. And my guess is that we are still probably 12, 18, 24 months away from that, but we will get there. And our idea is therefore, and already we see that there are people who are sort of jumping into the market. They're doing some quite shoddily produced Bollywood and current affairs podcasts, but we hope that even in the coming years, if we are not the largest, we will definitely be seen as a quality player, definitely be seen as doing podcasts that each one of them is quite unique. And I think what we have right now on Audiomatic is a pretty good demonstration of that, and we hope to add another 6 to 8 podcasts in the next couple of years, and hopefully make this a viable business.
I think we've barely scratched the surface of what's possible. I mean, just to give you an example, all our podcasts are still English podcasts, and this is a country with gigantic Indian language communities. I mean, just think of the potential of podcasts in all these different Indian languages. I mean, there are logistical issues that would have to be handled in producing them. But as I said, the potential is huge. I mean, you just have to find a way to get people to understand the medium and how to produce in the medium. And this is where the quality issue comes in, because as I said, Rajesh has been charitable about the other podcasts, but I think many of them are very well intentioned. But the quality really loses you. And I think with podcasts in particular, quality really matters, because if you don't get someone listening in the first minute or two, you just lose them. I lose interest in a podcast where people are rambling too much, or for instance, one real problem is if you have a bunch of friends who get together to do a podcast and they're all talking, they're all really friendly with each other, and then the listeners excluded. I mean, this happens all the time.
Right.
I mean, I'm sure you guys are having a great time doing the podcast, but what about the listener? Nobody's. So, the quality issue, I think, really matters a lot more than a lot of the people who are getting into it now understand. And I think this is the one thing where I think Audiomatic has a big advantage. Because Rajesh was absolutely clear about this from day one, that whatever we do has to be, to an international standard of quality. And this is really where Abdul comes in, because, I used to write the script and I used to think, he's the guy who really does the production. And if the podcasts are good at all in any length, it's because of him. And, you want to talk about some of the quality issues and where you think some of the other guys make simple mistakes?
So as Vikram said, that the brief that we got from Rajesh in the beginning, that we listened to a lot of American podcasts, and he said it should sound, and Rajesh's brief to us was that it should sound in terms of content and stuff, in terms of storytelling, and also in terms of the audio quality. So I think when it comes to radio, there's only few basics that one need to understand and follow them. And for example, just get a good mic, pop filter, and the distance of the speaker from the mic, and some basic tinkering here and there, which can give you a really high quality podcast. Which, as Vikram is saying, the others in the Indian market, the newbies in the Indian market have not understood it, or probably they underestimate the production quality of an audio setup. To understand that a mic just if it is kept on anywhere in the room is not going to record your sound. You need to understand the pickup pattern, where it has to be kept. It's very very simple, but it needs to be understood. It needs to be followed, and that's why probably and we follow here that very strictly, and that's why our quality has a distinct advantage over others. One thing that I really
and one important thing is you just have to listen to podcasts. We listen to guys like you. I mean, and that's how we end up. I think a lot of people are just jumping into podcasts because they heard the term and they want to do podcasts, but they actually haven't put in that time listening to podcasts and listening to they don't. There's no standard. They don't have a standard on which to produce their podcasts.
And even post production, something like editing is not given that much value. It's just put the camera, put the mic on, put the mic off, and whatever the file is.
It's agonizing. Sometimes you just want to slap these people a bit because sometimes they're saying really interesting things, but because they just haven't thought through the production, it becomes really agonizing.
I think I just jump in here and talk about one other thing that I don't know if we mentioned this, but all our podcasts are between 15 and 20 minutes. We do not have any podcast that is over 20 minutes. Most of them are around 15, 16 minutes. And this is by design, because the little research that we did before we started Audiomatic was that we found that people, there was even with a 15-minute podcast, it was fairly challenging to get people to listen right through. But anything above 15, 16, 18 minutes, the odds drop very, very, very sharply after the 16th, 17th minute. And so if you're under 12, 14 minutes, it's insubstantial, because after someone goes through the effort of downloading or subscribing or whatever, they want to listen to something that feels like a full piece of journalism or storytelling. But if it's more than 20 minutes, so therefore I think a lot of the work that we do, while Abdul talked about the production, a lot of the work that we do happens even before you go into production. Because it's the cliche that often what you leave out is more important than what you keep in. So Vikram Doctor will come to a recording with an hour's worth of material. Now, to get that down to 15, 16 minutes is very challenging. But at the same time, we don't want to exclude anything. We don't want to. So I think a lot of the storytelling happens on paper. It's planned. We know that these are the different elements required to tell a complete story. But at the same time, you do not have the luxury to ramble on and on and on, because you're doing this for a listener. You're not doing this for yourself. And it's very important to keep in mind that the listener is going to reject you if it doesn't prescribe, it doesn't sort of, fit into what their frame of mind is. I think we're probably running out of time. So there's just one other aspect that I want to talk about that perhaps some of you are curious about, which is the economics of it. So how do you make money?
There's no money.
So I think unlike so again, I think related to what I've been saying earlier, because it's a relatively small market, it's very niche. We do not have the MailChimp and Squarespace and I experience intense envy when I listen to American podcasts and they all begin and end with a word from our sponsor. Those words would be music to my ears when we had them on our podcast. So while we've had some success with and when I say some, I mean minor successes with selling sponsorships, it's an uphill task, because we still have to get to a stage where we are part of the sort of consciousness of the advertiser, where they see this as a legitimate medium, where they see that there are large enough numbers, and like I said, that that are there other therefore you may ask that are there other forms of funding. Well, subscription is very difficult to sell in India. Almost no content. I think except for sort of the Netflix and Netflix equivalent. But even like the sort of Indian Netflix, which is called Hotstar, it costs $3 a month, which is ridiculously a ridiculously small amount. So selling subscriptions is very difficult. We do not have, because of the lack of public radio, we do not have the culture or the sort of environment for public funding. I think apart from advertising funding or self-funding, which is what we are currently. The only other option is if you're seen as a public medium, doing media, creating media content that might be seen as a public service. There is now some possibility for being able to get some kind of institutional funding. We haven't explored that yet, but I think maybe that is something that will be an option in the future.
Because at the end of the day, the costs are really low. I mean, it's people spend so much on a couple of minutes of television. I mean, our costs are like a fraction of that. I mean, so it's certainly possible to survive, but yeah, some more money would be nice.
Yep. Yeah, actually, if there are any questions, we'll be happy to take them. Because we are used to 15-20 minute formats. This seems a bit long for any questions if there are.
I mean, I just want to come back to the accents thing, because this has been a curious preoccupation of mine, because it's been really fascinating to me, and I wonder how channels abroad deal with this multiple accents and how people get to understand. I mean, I said one understanding for me is how much Indian understanding of accents has moved because of Hollywood, from the sort of BBC sort of standard English accent to a sort of neutral American accent. But even then, we have problems. Like, remember we had that South African lady, who was, she gave a lovely interview, but when you tried playing it for people in the office, I mean, nobody could understand her. I mean, and we just had to not use up her inputs because it was just too difficult. People were just switching off. And this has been an interesting challenge, because at one level, the accents and the differing accents are what make a podcast interesting, and it brings it alive. But at the same time, you can't drift too much from what's acceptable to the average listener, because then they get lost. But I don't know if this is something that happens abroad as well.
Yeah, so I think Jason mentioned that his grandmother's from Ukraine, and there's a question on what our next major milestone is. I think that so I would say that there is a target that we have set for ourselves, which is also some kind of a psychological number. I think if we can hit 1 million listeners a month, that would make us a significant media platform. I think that is also linked to, obviously, for any business that is currently being funded or subsidized by the founders, your first objective is really to be operationally break even. So basically earn enough money to cover your costs. And I think that the two milestones would kind of go hand in hand. It is my hypothesis that if we hit 1 million listeners, we will be able to earn enough advertising sponsorship to cover the fundamental, the basic costs, direct costs of running this operation. And I think that how far away from that we are, I would say that at least a year, if not more. But I'm also 100% confident that it will happen. I think the big play for us is to maintain quality, to be sort of dogged about it, to keep adding new podcasts. and just keep at it until there is a shift in the market where the entire proposition becomes commercially and financially viable. And I continue to believe that India currently, among the new markets, is the most exciting media market in the world. This is borne out by everyone from Facebook to Google to the big television players who have huge investments here. Um, uh, we believe that this is an exciting market, and even a niche podcast place such as ours could have a couple of million monthly listeners. And if you have a couple of million monthly listeners who are of a certain profile, who are of a certain, that you're delivering a quality audience, which I believe we are, I think it can be financially viable.
I mean, I think we're at that point because what has happened in the mobile phone market is now actually cheap smartphones are everywhere. I mean, in the last couple of years, cheap Chinese-made smartphones through which you can listen to podcasts are anywhere. Now we have like 3G moving on to 4G, like data streaming. So the hardware is there. People, as I said, we started off by saying have lost the podcast, the radio listening habit, but it is there in this country. I mean, and we just have to get them back to it.
Yes. Yes. Are we launching new podcasts in the near future? We have a couple of them at the drawing board stage now. I think we will launch 2 more before the end of this year. I'm being vague about whether it will be the end of the calendar year, financial year, because our financial year ends in March. But yes, we will have 2 more podcasts, and then and I'm hoping that in 2017 or maybe the first quarter of 2018, the number of podcasts we have are in the double digits. And
also that there will be more good quality podcasts, because really at this point nobody's competing with each other. We're very open. We really welcome new good quality podcasters, and I think we're happy to share expertise. As long as they don't steal our booth. I mean that's the
only. Because I mean obviously it is a lot of hard work, and sometimes it's hard work. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this. Often it's hard work without immediate financial reward. And sometimes, I know it sounds horribly old-fashioned to say this, but sometimes you do something because you just love the medium. And we love the medium. And therefore, we are hoping that, we can do more of this. To answer your question, we are hoping that it's 1 million monthly listeners across the network, not first show. I think we are quite a distance away from that. I think maybe in the 2020s, we'll get to 1 million listens per show. But right now, in the foreseeable future, we'd be happy if we were network-wide 1 million. Yep. So, guys, thanks for having us. If there are any more questions, happy to take them. Or there's a great initiative. Happy International Podcast Day. Thank you. It's very privileged. It's a privilege for us to have our names against the Indian flag. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you guys. Man, I know our chat room was really blown up over there. You guys painted a great picture of what's going on over there in India, and I'm glad that we connected on Twitter. As Jason said it, I mean, you guys crushed it. You guys said so many great things that we as podcasters can learn and about the community itself. So thank you guys for coming on, representing India. I'm so glad we got to connect. That was the one missing piece from last year that I wanted to get this year, and I'm so glad we connected because it's too far for me to understand. So I'm glad that you guys were able to come on. So with the last minute we have here, I will let you guys plug your website, maybe your Twitter handle, whatever you guys want to do.
Yep. So the website is audiomatic.in. All our podcasts are there. The podcast that we referred to, Vikram Doctor's podcast, is called the Real Food Podcast. The science podcast we do is called The Intersection. We have one called Our Last Week. Our Twitter handle is at Audiomatic IN. Yep, that's it. Thank you. Thanks again.